All right, so part two, Abraham and Sarah, or Abram and Sarai. So we are in Genesis 16, starting in verse 3. So after Abram had lived in Canaan for 10 years, Sarai, Abram's wife, gave Hagar, the Egyptian servant, to her husband to be his wife. He had relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. Once Hagar realized she was pregnant, she despised Sarai. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You have brought this wrong on me. I allowed my servant to be with you, but when she realized that she was pregnant, she despised me. May the Lord judge between you and me." And Abram said to Sarai, "Since your servant is under your authority, do whatever you think is best." Then Sarai treated Hagar harshly, so she ran away. So there's a lot of things going on right there, a lot of dysfunction. I am certainly not an expert on marriage. I am not. But I dare say giving your spouse another partner is going to be beneficial. You know what I'm saying? And so I want to take a moment just to say this about polygamy. While polygamy was culturally accepted during this time period, it was never God's direction or will. Never. Polygamy actually came from Cain's family, and you can trace it all the way back to Cain's family. That is a very dysfunctional family, a very self-centered family, a family that for the most part did not follow God at all. From the beginning, God paired a man and a woman together to be one. Not one man and two wives, but one man and one woman. So there are some great men in the Bible that participated in polygamy, including one of my favorites, King David. Again, that does not mean it was God's will. Just because it's in the Bible does not mean that's what God wanted. But here's what it does reveal. It does reveal God's ability to use anybody in any situation while unveiling his great love for people. It does reveal that God bears with us. He's long suffering with us in all our flaws and all our dysfunction. That's how much he loves us. So that's what that should reveal. There's a lot of examples of what not to do in the Bible. They're not all examples of what to do, but there's a lot of don't do this. So when we move on in this passage, in verse 5, where Sarai is kind of griping at Abraham, saying this is his fault, it's really a result of her not waiting on the Lord, and his fault, because he didn't aid his wife in her faith development by encouraging her to stay the course like God had done for him. Now, Sarai was really in a family mess, a family unit that was just a mess. And I think we've all been there. We've all been in a family unit where there's just a big mess. And there's no shame in that. But do take it to the Lord so he can bring some order into the mess. Hagar despised Sarai, or what that means is she shunned her. That's what that means. She began to look down upon her. So what happens is her ego got the best of her, and it kind of elevated her above where she really was. It's always in our best interest to stay humble, but this poor little girl, kind of rough. It was a rough life. When you look at verse 6, Sarai again was self-seeking, and she did not consider Hagar's feelings at all. And what we see is sadly that she gives Hagar no compassion in the situation. It's really not that far of a cry, since her husband not too long ago didn't think about her feelings at all, Sarah's feelings at all, when he asked her to lie, and she was taken by the king of Egypt. So we're seeing you reap what you sow, or you sow what you reap, however you want to say it. And so what we see is that Sarai reacted out of emotion time and time again. Emotion will often lead us into a mess if we don't get hold of it, especially when we're reacting or responding out of it. And it's the second time that Abram finds himself in a mess. The first time was when he was back in Egypt. Now he's at home. And this mess includes himself, Sarai, Hagar, and eventually it's going to include Ishmael. So when you look at Sarai and her dysfunction, she reacted out of deep despair for being childless. As a woman, as a mother, I completely understand with that. In this time period that she lived, women were frowned upon if they were barren. In fact, society often thought that if a woman could not have children, then she was being punished for some sin she had committed, or she was cursed. So in this moment, Sarai's faith was very fragile in her despondency. And I think that is something we can all identify with, being in this despondent state, and we're just reacting out of emotion because we're in a lot of pain. When you find yourself in those situations, it's important just to invite God into your pain. Even if you're lashing out, even if you're going into prayer and you're using words that are pretty colorful, go ahead and invite God into that mess and open a dialogue and let him begin to soothe you. What we don't see is that Sarai ever cries out to God, ever invites him, ever seeks him out, which is very different than Hannah, who is Samuel's mother, or even Elizabeth, who is John the Baptist's mother. We don't see her seek God out at all, okay? And so here's what happens. In this dysfunctional state, she felt desperate. And with those emotions, the devil just swooped right in. He just swooped right in and he misguided her. And the result was more misery than before. And so the devil loves to mislead us into thinking that we can create a better solution than God while removing faith from the equation. That's what the devil loves to do. He loves to remove faith from the equation and tell us we can come up with our own solution that's going to trump God. That's just not the case. And for Abram and Sarai, these are faith-filled people. That's the beauty of the story, is that even though these are faith-filled people, these are patriarchs of the Israelite society, and yet they're filled with dysfunction. And God still loves them, and he still has a purpose for them, and we still get to use them as these great examples. But they're no better than you and I, and that's the point of this Bible study. That's the point of looking at the dysfunctional families in the Bible. So what we see with Hagar is Hagar was uprooted from her home. She was forced to marry a man she didn't love. And now, at this point, she's required to have a child for another woman. So if she had had any sympathy for her mistress Sarai, that was long gone by such treatment. Long gone. Like, bye, right? It's gone. So with this required marriage that she entered into was a new status and a new role in the clan. And it's a role that she's not really prepared for. And so her ego got the best of her. And I think, again, we can all relate to that in hindsight, where we look back and we're like, ugh, I was operating out of some pride there, some ego. And, you just kind of feel like, a little yucky. I want you to notice that while Hagar was transplanted to a faith-filled family, nobody was teaching or encouraging her to trust the Lord. Nobody. So how could she respond in faith? Faith is learned. She was in a difficult position to develop faith. Dysfunction, again, leads to more dysfunction, which is what we're seeing. But despite Hagar's conditions, God seeks her out. So Hagar, out of desperation, runs away, and we see God intervene on her behalf and on Ishmael's behalf, which is her baby. And so in verse 16, in chapter 16, verse 6, it says, Then Sarai treated Hagar harshly, so she ran away. The Lord's angel found Hagar near a spring of water in the desert, and so he encourages her to go back. No situation is too far gone for God to intervene on our behalf if you will ask him, if you will trust him and invite him into the situation. What we see with Sarai and Hagar is, one, Sarai is bitter. She's bitter. She's hurting. And she treated Hagar with hostility. And really with no compassion. This is the opposite of how God treated Abraham or Sarah. Listen, God's wrath, of course, is to be feared. But God is gentle and he's slow to anger. He is long-suffering with us, first and always. That's his first response. Had Sarai been tending to her own faith, maybe she could have avoided this messy situation that she and her maid found themselves in. But most importantly, had Abram walked in faith and not fear, perhaps Hagar would not even have been there at all. But that's not what we see. And that wasn't Abram's motivation at the beginning. The second thing that we see is that God seeks those that are not looking for him. Abram wasn't looking for God, and yet God still called to Abram. Hagar's not seeking God, and yet God found Hagar. God is personal, and we've seen that from the very beginning of this study. God is personal and desires to bring solutions to our problems while assisting us at cleaning up our messy lives. So God will bring order to our chaos if we will allow him. When we go to chapter 17 in Genesis, verse 1, it says, "When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, 'I am the sovereign God. Walk before me and be blameless.'" So there's already been a mess that's occurred, and God shows up again to Abram. So again, we see God's long-suffering and incredible love for us. There's a reason why God shows up. Preparation is the key to overcoming temptation, which leads to dysfunction. This is not God telling Abram to be sinless, because that's just not possible. But what he is saying is, live a life that's worthy of me. That's what he's telling Abram. So God is urging Abram to develop his faith and to not look for a solution of his own without inquiring first of the Lord's advice. And I like how the Complete Jewish Bible words this verse. The Complete Jewish Bible says, "I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Walk in my presence and be pure-hearted." So El Shaddai means Almighty, which translates all-powerful. I'm the all-powerful God. Nothing is too difficult for me to accomplish. And it's important to note, because God is about to move in Abram and Sarai's life, that really is going to leave them pretty speechless. And so what we see is that God moves through faith, and he needs Abram's and Sarai's faith to be confident in his abilities. It's important that we evaluate whether our faith is confident in God's abilities or not, and then we take our findings to the Lord. So God is urging Abram to continue to develop that faith, but he's also encouraging him to walk by faith and not sight. That's a tall order for us humans, but it's accomplishable with the help of the Lord. So in this first verse, in 17, where God says, "I am the sovereign God, walk before me and be blameless," here's what he's saying. Here are 4 things that God's saying. He's saying, "I am all powerful. Nothing is too difficult for me to accomplish. I'm the Almighty. I'm El Shaddai." The second thing that he does is he urges Abram to live in his presence and not out of his presence. Live in my will and not out of my will. The third thing is he encourages Abram to be blameless, which means to live an exemplary life before the Lord. Because as believers, we're to live a life of example for others. And the fourth thing, it's God building faith up in Abram so that he can withstand any doubt. When we move to verse 15 in chapter 17, it says, "Then God said to Abram, 'As for your wife, you must no longer call her Sarai. Sarah will be her name, and I will bless her and will give you a son through her.'" So in this chapter, in chapter 17, and we're not really going to get too deep into it because this is not what we're studying, but for the sake of the verse, God changes the names of Abram and Sarah to Abraham and Sarah. And, without getting off track